Much, Madam Baldestin, Excellencies, Director Daniela Bas at Desa, Mr. Pier Paolo Saporito of OCAM, distinguished co-panelists, fellow NGO representatives, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for including me in this grand conversation under the auspices of OCAM. I am deeply honored because I am a repeat speaker. Thank you, Pier Paolo, for asking me again to speak before one of your distinguished conferences. Matters about digitalization are matters about communication, both in the broadest sense as well as in a more focused way when dealing with information communications technologies. At the outset, I would like to say that the digitization of knowledge and information and the digitalization of the same are fraught with moral and ethical considerations. Talk of digital divide and digital inequalities that point to some of the moral and ethical issues because of their intersections with larger economic, political, social, and cultural divides. Because communication is intrinsic to our humanity and the relations we build, the right to communication and the access to information are basic human rights, essential to human dignity and to a just and democratic society. The focus of this first session points to both the promise and peril of digitalization. The promise has to do with the larger burden of this conference, how to foster the basic principles of a new approach for a fairer and more inclusive digital society. The peril is embedded in the promise itself, how to be active participants in building a future society that is fairer and inclusive rather than being a passive audience. Well put. Building a future with technologies changing by the second is a future besieged with intersecting pandemics of health and social natures, is to say the least, commendable at best and mission impossible at worst. In the few minutes that I have, I would like to address this from two perspectives. As the president of CoNGO, the Conference of NGOs in general consultative status with the United Nations, and that of the General Board of Church and Society, two organizations I represent at the UN. I will orient my presentation with the lens of a trained social and political ethicist. CoNGO has been and currently a conduit of the ongoing multilateral processes arising from the World Summit on Information Society in Geneva of 2003 and Tunis in 2005. At these conferences and the follow-up WSIS forums today, NGOs asserted and say that at the heart of communication and knowledge systems are values and ethics that underline the vision of peoples and organizations for just, peaceable, secure, inclusive, participatory, sustainable, and democratic societies. From these assertions, I suggest that the digital society we ought to foster must not only be fairer, but just, not only inclusive, but truly participatory, not only efficient, but sustainable. These are values of moral significance, even as they are already part of normative multilateral frameworks. We are in a knowledge and information-based society. The use of technology in producing and enhancing knowledge, hence also of producing and reproducing information, must be subjected to critical ethical lenses of access, but also responsible and sustainable stewardship. These ethical lenses bring subsidiary but intrinsic values to what we call ICTs. These values include justice, sustainability, and participatory democracy. And at the core of these ethical values is the voice and agency of human beings who are the conscious producers and consumers of digitalized knowledge and information. A strong moral compass is needed to direct the magnetic orientation of digital communication to the ethical true north of our humanity. Crucial to the principle of access and stewardship in the use of information communications technology is the recognition of vulnerable and marginalized peoples, say, for example, migrants, internally displaced peoples, and refugees. I will say a little bit more on that one in a few minutes. Non-access amounts to the violation of the fundamental right to information. The ethical dimensions of the information society are constitutive of the respect for peace and the upholding of the fundamental values of freedom, equality, solidarity, tolerance, shared responsibility, and more. This panel is conceived with the proposition that we are living in a moment of gestation towards new forms of society that are arising all over the world in different shapes, operated by digital innovations that are now part of the common practices of life, work, and governance. To this conception, I suggest that the digital society we ought to foster must also, and more importantly, be peaceable and secure for people and the planet. And by security, I mean not just national security, but more urgently, human and planetary security. This is in keeping with a global ethic already inscribed in Agenda 2030, especially the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. But something crucial that is at the heart of civil society advocacy has to do with access, both physical access to the venues of policy decision making and political access to the policy decision makers themselves. Digitalization as a function of information communications technology has enhanced and supplemented our strivings and efforts for human connection, for national cohesion, and multilateral collaboration. These efforts thrive and flourish because they are requisites to human and institutional connections. How to ensure that digitalization does not diminish, but rather enhance these connections must be a priority. But we know that digitalization has also challenged, indeed imperiled, even alienated us from both physical and political access, without which meaningful democratic participation in determining the life and governance we want becomes suspect. The digital modes of communications and relations that we have both consciously devised and unwittingly succumbed to for our health, well-being as mitigatory measures demand a revisiting. The fundamental principles of inclusion, participation, transparency, and accountability were conceived as elements of access to the physical venues and to persons with significant roles in decision-making. These principles were compromised under COVID-19 restrictions. As we therefore retool for a post-COVID world, the restrictions we have come to accept must not metastasize as to colonize our bodies and the body politic and render our toolkits for life and living, for governance especially, inutile in the flourishing of human dignity and the fostering of justice and democratic practices. Let me just name a few of the areas that demand our attention for what makes a digital society that is a fairer and more inclusive. And I conclude at this point. One, digitalization and human rights. Access to knowledge and information is a human right, intrinsic to one's personhood and to be enjoyed in community with other human beings. The denial of access, and in this case to information and knowledge, especially digitalized knowledge, would to me amount to the denial of human rights to information. The promise and the peril of a digitalized society lies at the high degree of alienation of warm-blooded human beings to the cold, digitized data and technologies that codify their lives and their activities. Two, digitalization and peace. The role of digitalization in fostering peace bears reinforcing. I say this because the technologies for war and warmongering is far more developed and lethal than the technologies for peace and life-giving. We must reinforce our efforts and resolve to meet the targets for SDG 16 that are about promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development. But we know that the promise and peril of digitalization lies in the fact that the junctions of the architecture of ICT for peace are so thin with that of the ICT for war. Third, and last, digitalization and multilateralism. Global collaboration is key to tackling both lingering and emerging crises. This is true for historic injustices due to slavery, colonialism, and racism, as it is also for today's crisis and pandemics, health crisis, climate crisis, migration crisis, racial crisis, and violence. I submit to you that a fairer and inclusive digital society must have this lingering and emerging crisis in full consideration, lest that digital society becomes not the handmaiden of sustainable development, but the harbinger of assured destruction of both peoples and the planet. Ladies and gentlemen, digitalization deals with democracy. The report of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation must be a starting point, because these discussions of the future of work, the future of data, the future of social media, the future of cyberspace, the future of life together are matters that belong to multilateral discourse as much as to fundamental safeguarding of democracy that digitalization must ensure. Digitalization must be part of the common public good. And yet we know that the promise and peril of a digitalized society lies at the visible and palpable uses of ICTs for the violations of human rights and for the accumulation of ever more wealth to the peril and alienation of ever more people in the rich and poor divide. Ladies and gentlemen, digitalization and global citizenship are crucial to this enterprise. And I thank OCTAM for highlighting so that we can have the possibility of refusing digitalization to be the vehicle of hate and violence in our world today. The promise and peril of digitalization is that it is able to win the false facts and new dangers, even as we also seek new ways of teaching and learning what it is that brings us together as peoples in a sustainable planet. Thank you very much. I hope that I have not abused too much of your time.